Los Angeles in the 1950s was a city caught between innocence and identity. To the rest of America, it looked like a paradise of palm trees, sunshine, and convertibles. But underneath the postcard image, there was a quiet storm building. Newcomers were pouring in from the South, Mexico, and the Southwest, chasing work and weather, only to find neighborhoods sliced apart by redlining and new freeway maps. Out of that fractured landscape, a generation of teenagers started building something of their own: street crews, car clubs, and neighborhood identities that would become the foundation of modern Los Angeles culture. The story really begins with the kids who grew up watching their parents survive the war and then come home to a city that didn't know what to do with them. The Pachuco style of the 1940s hadn't vanished after World War II. It had simply evolved. The zoot suits and long watch chains gave way to pressed khakis, white t-shirts, and slick hair. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake, it was pride. After years of being told they didn't belong, Mexican-American and black teenagers in neighborhoods like Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights, Watts, and South Central created their own language of belonging. They called themselves clubs more often than gangs. To outsiders, they were trouble. To each other, they were family. Their names were stitched onto jackets or painted onto the backs of cars. Tight-knit crews that blended friendship, fashion, and territory into a new kind of identity. And in Los Angeles, identity meant cars. The 1950s were when the car became the ultimate badge of freedom. Some kids built hot rods in driveways. Others lowered Chevrolets and cruised the boulevards. The lowrider movement was still in its early form, homegrown and mechanical, long before it became a national symbol. Young Chicanos in East LA and the Valley were experimenting with hydraulics, learning how to drop cars low without destroying the suspension, turning a piece of Detroit steel into a rolling piece of art. Cruising down Whittier Boulevard or Atlantic Avenue in those days wasn't yet the massive event it would become in the 60s, but the seeds were there. Teenagers turned parking lots and drive-ins into showcases. Cars weren't just transportation, they were stagecraft, sound systems, and social currency all rolled into one. And that relationship between car culture and youth identity is still what defines Los Angeles today. Music carried the same energy. On one side of the city, you had doo-wop and rhythm and blues echoing through school gyms and backyard parties. On the other, local Chicano rock and harmony groups were rewriting American pop from the inside. The blend of cultures, African-American rhythm, Mexican-American harmony, West Coast slang, built a sound that was unmistakably LA. By the late 1950s, those small bands, street singers, and amateur DJs were laying the groundwork for what would become a permanent rhythm in Los Angeles life: the backyard party scene. But the culture wasn't all music and machines. It was also survival. The LAPD, under Chief William Parker, had been rebuilding its image after years of corruption. By the late 1950s, the department was disciplined, centralized, and increasingly militant. Parker believed in tight control, and that meant tight policing. The city's growing youth crews became an obsession for his officers. Curfew sweeps, truancy arrests, and stop-and-frisk encounters became common. Kids who were mostly hanging out were documented as gang members, sometimes for life. That kind of policing had an unintended effect. It hardened the lines between neighborhoods. When a cop patrols your block like it's enemy territory, you start to treat it like one. The stronger the pressure, the stronger the identity. For a lot of these kids, defending their neighborhood wasn't just about pride. It was about existing in a city that treated them as outsiders. By the late 50s, small local clubs started taking on bigger reputations. In Watts, in South Central, and around South Park, early African-American groups formed around sports, dances, and neighborhood pride, roots that would eventually grow into more organized sets in the 1960s. In East LA, the same pattern played out in miniature. Dozens of small barrio clubs formed around schools and blocks, like the ones in El Sereno or Boyle Heights. None of them knew it yet, but they were shaping the blueprints for decades of youth culture. And in the background, Los Angeles itself was being rearranged. The first wave of freeways, the Harbor, Hollywood, and early segments of the Santa Monica, began cutting through communities in the late 1950s. But the full impact came later, in the 1960s, when neighborhoods like East LA Pico Aliso and parts of South Central were split down the middle by new construction. The result was physical fragmentation. Friends and families literally separated by concrete. Crews that once lived within walking distance suddenly found themselves boxed off by overpasses and ramps. Territoriality became more local, more personal, and more permanent. Culture adapted. What couldn't move found new forms. Teenagers marked walls and alleys with names written in stylized block letters, at first in pencil, then marker, then spray paint. These early hand styles, rooted in Pachuco calligraphy, evolved into the tall, vertical Chicano scripts that later became known worldwide as Cholo writing. It wasn't just graffiti, it was geography written in ink. The same pride showed up in how kids dressed. Clean lines, sharp creases, white tees, fitted jeans, and hairnets, the early uniform of the barrio and the block. The famous Pendleton shirts, buttoned only at the top, would come slightly later in the early 1960s, but the attitude behind the look was already there. Clothes weren't chosen for rebellion, they were chosen for precision, for representing the group without needing to say a word. If you trace LA's creative DNA, the murals, the tattoos, the music, the slang, the custom cars, they all lead back here. These were the kids who turned hardship into art. They didn't wait for permission to express themselves. They painted walls when galleries wouldn't take them. They built cars when they couldn't afford new ones. They started block parties when clubs wouldn't let them in. Los Angeles didn't give them space, so they built their own. And even though the city called it delinquency, time proved it was actually invention. The same neighborhoods that police and newspapers once labeled gang-infested would become the heart of Los Angeles style, the source of its fashion, its rhythm, its identity. From Watts to Boyle Heights, from Pacoima to East LA, those 1950s youth crews wrote the blueprint that every later generation, punk, hip-hop, lowrider, graffiti, and streetwear, would eventually borrow from. They taught Los Angeles how to turn struggle into swagger, how to wear your city like armor, how to make your block, your style, your sound, and your name something the world couldn't ignore. The irony is, the rest of the world eventually copied it. The slang, the clothes, the cars, the walls. But what they copied was only the surface. The real legacy of those 1950s youth gangs isn't about toughness or violence. It's about ownership, a kind of street citizenship that said, "This is ours, we built it, and we belong here." That spirit still drives Los Angeles. You can see it in a Sunday lowrider cruise, a backyard DJ set, or a mural on an old brick wall that somehow survived the bulldozers. Every one of those things traces back to a generation of teenagers who took the city's rejection and turned it into identity.